All right, I'm gonna wait about another minute or two just to make sure we allow everybody time to get in. All right, we have now hit 1300 Eastern Standard Time. So hopefully we have everybody joining us now on the webinar. So I'll go ahead and get started. First off, I want to thank everyone for coming on. My name is Luke Shabra. I'm Deputy Director for the Army Mad Scientist Initiative. So if you're here, you wanted to come and learn about the campaign that we've been working on, which is really looking at the weaponization of information. So today we're very honored to have Mr. Vincent O'Neil. Vince is a risk assessor, a public speaker, a writer, a West Point grad, and he's also a sci-fi author, most recently of a book series called The Sim Wars. We are really excited to have Vince today. He's going to talk to us today about the disinformation space on the marketplace. And on top of that, Vince actually submitted a really fantastic paper to our Operational Environment 2035 contest, where we're trying to gather and crowdsource some ideas for what we think about the future of weaponization of information and in general, the future operational environment. We're really happy to have Vince on here. So thanks so much for coming, Vince, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Luke. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you and everyone at Mad Scientist, as well as the good folks at Georgetown, and anyone who had a hand in setting this up. It's much appreciated. As Luke already said, I'm Vincent O'Neil. I'm an author of novels and short stories in science fiction, mystery, and horror. And one of the things I do when I'm developing an idea or a plot line or plot twist is one of the tools is I ask a question that I imagine many of you use in your work. And that question is, what if? What if this happens here? What if that happens over there? And what if this thing that was supposed to happen doesn't? So I took that what if analysis and I applied it to the real world issue of how our personal electronic devices are being used to collect information on us. And the result was this paper, The Information Disruption Industry and the Operational Environment of the Future. And let's jump right in. Can we go to the next slide, the outline, please? So I've got an executive summary for you. And then I'm going to go into the details of that. I'm going to talk about this information disruption industry that I think is due to expand in the near future. Then I'll cover the ramifications for the operational environment. And finally, because we don't raise an issue without offering solutions, I've got some first step recommendations for you as well. So let's jump onto that. Let's go to the next slide, please, the executive summary. Now, I know you all can read this, but I'm going to read it out loud for you anyway, just to give everybody a chance to consider the words. Use of everyday technology to collect personal data is increasing. And as these efforts become more intrusive, popular resentment is likely to grow. If that irritation reaches a tipping point, existing privacy protection services will expand enormously, creating an information disruption industry, or IDI, dedicated to thwarting the collection, storage, and sale of personal data. The expanded IDI's efforts will do direct and indirect damage to a wide range of systems, even systems unrelated to personal data collection. This likely scenario has the potential to seriously impact the information landscape in 2035, if not sooner. So can we go to the next slide, please? People are already aware that this is going on and they're concerned. It's hard not to be aware of it. You're typing an email, you mention something, a spot or a product, and before you know it, the next web page that you're looking at, there are pop-up ads on there that reflect that product. It's in the news as well, cases like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, demonstrating that this is widespread and it's going on without public consent. And something we've all gotten used to is stories in the news and the notification from corporations that they've had yet another data breach, that your personal information may have been compromised, that you should monitor your accounts, maybe change your passwords, and have a nice day. None of that is making people feel comfortable. In fact, it's generating resentment. May I have the next slide, please? Resentment is a strong emotion. It's a common emotion. It's something that you can experience at any time of any day. It's also a powerful motivator. It gets you to act. Now, I looked at a series of different definitions for resentment, but I picked this one because I think it applies to the topic at hand. Bitter indignation at being treated unfairly. One of the reasons people are feeling resentment about this data collection is that they're paying for the devices that are being used to collect information on them. Their phones, their cars, their access to the web. This tracking and collection is often concealed from them, and the information gathered from these devices has started to appear in court cases. So this could actually be used against you. Can I go to the next slide, please? Once people realize that this collection could actually be a threat to them, I think we're going to reach a tipping point where they're going to start paying for protection. Now, this might also happen just because the resentment reaches a high enough level where people shift from feeling it to acting on it. One of the reasons I think the resentment will reach that tipping point is because of the behavior of the collectors themselves. The collectors are already invasive and heavy-handed, and they're likely to get worse about that because the reason they're doing what they're doing is money. And when money is involved, the tendency is to push it as hard as you can. So I suspect that the level of resentment is going to go up high enough to reach a tipping point. But let's assume it doesn't. Just a few decades ago, the concept of identity theft burst on the cultural landscape. And at first, people didn't relate to it. They just didn't see it happening to them. The tipping point for that was when they started to hear the stories about people who are finding out that they had debts that were attached to them that they didn't incur, that someone had run up a credit card bill against them, that their solid gold credit score had been affected. And that's when they began paying for identity theft protection services. So just assume some news stories about this data collection that's going on now. What if you read about the victims of domestic violence who had fled their persecutors? They thought they got away, but then they were revealed by one of their devices and a tragedy ensued. What if you read about someone who was convicted in court using a largely circumstantial case with evidence collected from their personal data devices, and then you found out that individual was innocent? And what if you were applying for a job, or you had one of your children applying for a university? You had the qualifications, you didn't get the job, or they didn't get in, and later on you found out that social media analysis software had given each of you a low score that you knew was incorrect. Stories like those will get to the tipping point when people are going to see an actual harm from this data collection, and then they're going to start paying for protection. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, there are already businesses and entities in business that are offering the services that are designed to thwart this collection and sharing of your personal data. So once people are convinced that this collection is a threat, they're going to start paying to protect themselves. Money's going to flow into the existing businesses, and then the industry is going to expand. It's hard to imagine just what the industry is going to look like because it's so based in technology. It's going to follow the technology. One thing that we can probably assume is you're going to have an endless round of conflict between the collectors and the IDI, the information disruption industry. Measure, countermeasure, countermeasure. The IDI is likely to use a range of tactics that vary from stealthy alteration of data to crashing entire systems. We can assume that they're going to look for vulnerabilities at every step in the process: the collection, the storage, and the sale. And regardless of how stealthy or obtuse they are, they're all going to do damage to systems. And that's going to have ramifications for the operational environment. Now, one thing I think that I can assume here is that there are going to be differing levels of precision in the operators in the IDI. So I've got a scale at the bottom here. To the far left, you've got low levels of precision. They're going to be more of a blunt instrument attack, something similar to what the hackers do when they do a denial of service attack, where they simply swamp a system with too much input and it causes it to freeze up. That's kind of what I call a brute force and ignorance approach. The other end of the spectrum is going to be much more precise. It's surgical, it's targeted. That group I call the skill and daring group. And I'm going to be using those two terms, brute force and ignorance for imprecise, skill and daring for precise. It's largely an homage from when I was at West Point and I was studying physics. And I had this one instructor who was teaching us how to handle a multi-step physics problem. And by multi-step physics problem, I mean the answer to step 1 was used to get the answer to step 2, which was used to get the answer to step 3. So if you were wrong at step 1 or step 2, you're going to be wrong the rest of the way. And there were two approaches, and the instructor dubbed them the brute force and ignorance approach and the skill and daring approach. Now, skill and daring had the advantage of being fast, but you couldn't check your work. So the skill and daring approach to solving this physics problem was for people who had confidence in their ability to solve physics problems. I was not with that group. I was more on the other end of the spectrum there with the brute force and ignorance approach. Now, brute force and ignorance was slower, but it had the advantage that you could actually check your answer. So those are the two terms I'm going to be using for the two ends of the precision spectrum for the information disruption industry. And I was thinking about this the other night, and honestly, I think that the most harm is probably going to come from the middle of the spectrum, sort of a hybrid. They've got the skills to get past the security system, but they're still vandals at heart. So they slip past your security, but once they're inside, they start tearing out the walls. Regardless of their level of precision, they're all going to do damage. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the question might be asked, why would anybody who's seeking to disrupt something act in a precise fashion? Well, that's driven by the client's needs. Some of the clients are going to have things like good credit scores. They might be getting ready to apply for a job. They don't want to see the record of their education and employment blown out of the system. They don't want to see their existences removed from the databases. They're looking for that tailored surgical approach that you're going to get in the precise distribution. They're going to want to ask very specifically, make sure that they don't track my movements. Make sure they can't record my purchases. Make sure that they can't analyze my personal communications. One of their goals is to do this without detection. They want to get in and get out. That is, if they're going to the database. As with the other practitioners of the IDI, they're going to be attacking across the boards. So if they can block the collection at the source, that's what they'll do. That's hard to do, of course, because there are so many different ways the data is collected. They might try to get into the databases where it's stored and alter it there. Now, going into a database, taking out the client's information and leaving those cells blank isn't going to be what they're going to want to accomplish, because diagnostic software would probably indicate that that information was missing. So they're going to actually put innocuous information in that place. That's going to be very sophisticated stuff. And then at the far end, they might do something elegant. When you get to point of sale, it's been collected, it's been analyzed, stored, packaged, it's ready to go. If they come up with a way to flag the records of their clients so their records simply don't go when that package gets sent. Because they're so specific and because they're high end, they're going to be able to charge a premium. They're probably going to make a lot more money, and this will be the group that will then start attracting the staff from the collections industry itself. That's going to give them an insight into how the collections are done, how the data is stored, how it's sold, and that's going to give them another advantage in what they're trying to do. They'll be able to attract these people with better pay, and it's probably going to be more socially acceptable to be joining the IDI than it is to be part of the collecting side. After all, because they're invasive, Because they're heavy-handed, the collectors have not exactly endeared themselves to the public, whereas the IDI will be seen as their protectors. So just ask the question, you're at a party and someone asks you what you do, would you prefer to say, I fly an X-Wing fighter for the Rebel Alliance? Or would you like to say, I'm a data tech on the Death Star for the evil empire? Regardless of how precise this end of the spectrum is, they're still going to do damage because they are disrupting a system's normal functions. Systems out there that have people who are actually managing them, have control of the system, have access rights to that system, go inside a system, do simple maintenance, and mess it up anyway without meaning to, because sometimes this chunk of program code didn't agree with that chunk of program code. So think about having disruptors going in, even though they're trying to do this with stealth, but they're changing things without access rights. They're likely to disrupt these systems, and those are going to be unintended consequences that no one can actually predict. And if that's not bad enough, it's not going to be a single team doing this. It's going to be several different businesses, maybe more than several, numerous uncoordinated actors doing this kind of work. Can we go to the next slide, please? So now we've gotten to the brute force and ignorance group. Now, this is the original monkey wrench in the gears approach. They want to just jam everything up and break as much as they can. They're going to be more low end and low margin because they're not doing anything nearly as specific or sophisticated as the skill and daring group. Now, because they're low end, they won't be able to charge as much. Then they'll be low margin because low margin is just basically your profit. It's the difference between how much you can charge for something and what it costs you to do it. So when you are low margin, you're not making that much every time you do this. How do you make money? You make money by volume. And one of the ways you can increase your volume is keeping your prices low, and they're already there. Another way is getting a reputation for getting the job done, and a third way is to get publicity. Oddly enough, with the brute force and ignorance crowd, with the way that they work, they're going to get the reputation for getting things done, and they're going to get plenty of publicity by doing things like crashing entire systems. It's guaranteed that they're going to get your information out of there if they wreck the place. And if they wreck the place, it's probably going to make the news. And the interesting irony about that is that the stealthy skill and daring group, if they broke a system, they'd think that it was a huge mistake on their part. Whereas the imprecise brute force and ignorance actors are going to view that as publicity. Because of the nature of their attacks, they are also going to give cover for another threat, which is the hackers. It's going to be very difficult to identify a Trojan horse when it comes in the middle of a stampede. Oddly enough, the brute force and ignorance crowd might be the ones who do the most to protect your privacy overall, because by wrecking systems, casting doubt on the reliability of the collection efforts, they might just reduce the value of the purchased data and drive some of the collectors out of business. Next slide, please. It's likely this is going to end up in court at some point. No one can tell what the Supreme Court would decide on something like this. Obviously, much of what the IDI is doing is criminal in nature. Some of it is demonstrated harm to the systems, property damage. But there's also the question of, are they defending individual rights? And if the court came back and even suggested that the IDI was defending the individual rights of citizens, it makes them more socially acceptable. And if a case goes in their favor, that's going to give them legal protection. Now, the collectors being opposed to the IDI, once the IDI gets a legal stamp of approval or is just cast in the role of the protectors of the Rebel Alliance, well, anybody who opposes them is likely to be seen as the evil empire. If this actually becomes legal, it's interesting that the more precise operators could actually expand their service to offer to repair the damage that had been done by other actors. Can we go to the next slide, please? There's one word to sum up this whole environment if this IDI expands the way I'm talking about, and that is chaos. It's going to be a kaleidoscopic information landscape. It's going to have data that's going to be requiring frequent verification. You won't know what you can trust, and you're going to have systems that are malfunctioning randomly. And because you're going to have so many actors with uncoordinated activities, it's going to generate second-order effects as well that are going to be harmful and unpredictable. Can we go to the next slide, please? The entire world is getting more interconnected, and technology as well. That interconnected nature is going to magnify the impact of these disruptions, and it's going to generate problems in unexpected areas. Just think in terms of how the pace of acquisitions and mergers in the tech world have accelerated. At one point, you had System A over here. They have trouble. You hear about it, but you know that you're not going to have that trouble because you use System B. Then you find out that 5 years ago, System A's owners bought System B's owners. They kept System B's name because it had such good credibility. And then over time, there really was no separation between System A and System B. To go back to that multi-step physics problem that I referenced earlier, where if you got the answer wrong with step 1 or step 2, you were guaranteed to be wrong with step 3. Once the bad data gets in at any point, it's likely to continue. Bad data in equals bad data out. And the movement to hook everything that's got any kind of electricity floating through it, to hook those things onto the internet, is also going to give other avenues for the IDI to exploit its vulnerabilities, whether they mean to or not. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So one of the biggest concerns here is people are seeing their movements tracked and recorded, and the GPS system would play a large role in that. So the disruptors would definitely seek to disrupt the connection between the GPS and the tracking of individuals. They might try to attack GPS itself, but if they can't, they're going to see if they can get an entry point through the systems that connect to it. Very few days go by when I don't hold up my cell phone and see that it says, hey, you got to do all these updates. Updates, changes to code, hardwares, and protocols are all opportunities for the IDI to get into a system as well. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Now we've reached the point where we've got the ramifications for the operational environment. The expanded IDI has the potential to seriously impact that environment in 2035, if not sooner. Much of our military technology is created by civilian businesses, and they sell modified versions of those systems in non-military markets. And that intersection alone has the potential to cause a problem in the operational environment, a connection between the system being used by the military and one that is very similar to it that's available on the open market. Just as the IDI is going to be able to recruit people from the collecting side of the house, they will also seek to recruit former military personnel who are familiar with the military systems, know about their setup, operation, and their weaknesses, and exploit those. And just as the brute force and ignorance actors are going to provide cover for the hackers, the confused nature of this information landscape in the future is actually going to assist the actual enemy actors, other governments, and even non-governmental actors who are seeking to access government and military systems. They might even go in reverse, and they might think that they're going to access a civilian system by first getting into its military counterpart. Next slide, please. Now, in the operational environment, they're not necessarily going to have to hit they're not going to have to hit military targets exclusively. They might hit non-military targets. My dad was in World War II, and he was on several troop ships, and he mentioned to me years ago that one of the things that bothered him was once they were on the ships and they were in the middle of the ocean, they were going someplace. They weren't told where they were, and they weren't told where they were going, even though they had absolutely no ability to tell anybody any of that information. Our deployed service members are not like that now, and it's a good thing. They're able to get in touch with home. They're used to getting in touch with home, and they're largely using civilian communications to do that. So an interruption of a civilian communications system that prevents them from talking to their loved ones is going to be a distraction. Additionally, interruptions back at home, the compromised credit scores that I mentioned. Perhaps a bank is having difficulty because of the IDI and they had to freeze the bank accounts for a while. That's also going to distract our deployed soldiers from their missions. Next slide, please. I already mentioned the GPS system being used to track people, but if there is any kind of an interruption in the GPS, the ramifications for the operational environment are pretty obvious. You're going to have units that are going to be getting lost. You're going to have supplies that are being sent to the wrong places, and the GPS is part of many of the targeting systems. So you have the grave danger of errant ordnance. This stuff is going to be landing and exploding in the wrong place, potentially. And because the GPS links into so many systems, it's possible that those are going to be vectors for the IDI to get in. And if they can slip wrong information in, it's going to be a problem. Next slide, please. Additionally, civilian technology has created some marvelous systems for maintenance and logistical functions. And these systems are also being used by the military. And because they also have their civilian counterparts, the patches and the updates for these products are likely to go across all those systems. This is another vector for the IDI to get in. Next slide, please. Now we've reached the first step recommendations that I'd like to offer. Obviously, this is going to take a broad approach because the entire national defense apparatus is going to be involved. So I'd like to recommend that a supervisory authority should be put in charge of this. This does not necessarily mean a new commander, a new department, but somebody has to take charge of this to coordinate the activities. So that's the first step. Next slide, please. Now, verification of data. One of the most important issues once the IDI gets going is to know right away that something is wrong. You can't start fixing it until you know it's broken. Now, the myriad systems that we have in our defense department actually might be of an assistance here. Because if you can identify the information that is involved in different systems that could actually function as a check on each other. For example, in System A, they can tell you that this geographical location is here. System B also tracks geographical locations and can agree it is exactly where System A thinks it is. Now, I'm not talking about linking the systems together because that might create a vulnerability, but a check using the information across different systems might be a good way to verify the data and also raise a red flag when something doesn't agree with everything else. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Now, earlier I mentioned asking the question of what if. One of the things that our military does extremely well is conducting wargaming. But before you can do the wargaming, you got to create the board where the wargaming is going to take place. So what I'm going to recommend here is going to be awfully complex, awfully involved. If you actually tried to draw this diagram, you'd basically have to use the walls of the Grand Canyon, and you'd probably run out of Grand Canyon. Fortunately, high-tech nodal diagrams are becoming much better. They're making leaps and bounds here, and the use of this nodal modeling is going to come into play here. The supervisory authority should reach out to whoever's in charge of each of our systems. That's going to be a lot, but every system has to have somebody who's in charge of it. So the supervisory authority is going to reach out to each one of them and ask them to identify certain things about their systems. What are the inputs? and what systems connect to them. And then finally, what are the users? Now, I don't mean individual people. I mean things like what commands, what units, what departments, what teams. Once you've identified that, you can start your wargame, because now you've got the systems that the IDI is going to be attacking. You know what's connecting to them, what's accessing them. You know where they get their information, and if one of them drops out, you know the users, you know who's going to be affected. Then using this high-tech nodal diagramming, you're going to be able to wargame this by saying, okay, this system here is going to drop out now. Who's affected? And what do we do while that system is gone to recreate its functionality? Because the key here is not that the system dropped out, it's that the system is no longer doing certain things. So what is it doing? What was it doing? And are there other systems that now can be identified using this nodal diagram that shows the connections? What systems can help to take up some of the slack while we're getting that system back up and running? This can also reveal vulnerabilities. It can show you that, for example, you've got one information source that hooks into some large percentage of your systems, and if that's the only source, if it drops out, then those systems are left without their sources of information. That's something you'll have to address later on. And just on the cost-cutting side of the house, you might identify some systems that don't have very many users or not much data, and you might combine them with something else. But this is going to be the start point of the wargaming, creating the actual battle, the actual board that you're going to use for that wargaming. Next slide, please. So regardless of how hard we try, no matter how many different solutions we come up with, we have to be ready when a system's going to drop out. One of the things that's going to come out of the wargaming is identification of systems that can be used to do different parts of a system that's missing, if possible. The wargaming is going to identify those systems that if this one drops out, the game's over, and you're going to actually have to create a redundant system for that one. Next slide, please. The key here is once a system breaks, it's going to drop out, but we're going to bring it back up as soon as possible. Private industry is very good at this. Disaster recovery, data recovery. One of their approaches is to identify a last functioning point before the disruption, which harkens back to that point about know as soon as you have the disruption that it happened. And that way you can identify everything was working up to here, now it's not. That's the last functioning point. If you have data archived, if you have programming saved, one technique is to simply drop everything out and reset to that last functioning point. One of the things you're going to have to develop at that point is essentially what they call a user acceptance testing environment, because the last thing you want to do to operators in the field is have a system drop out, you think you fixed it, you turn it back on, tell them to use it, and it's still broken. You're going to have some kind of an environment. Once you reset this thing, it's still away from the operational environment. You're going to test it. You're going to know what your steps are to test it. Then you'll be able to say, yes, it is back up and running like it's supposed to, and we'll get it back into operation out in the field. Next slide, please. The people who use the systems frequently come up with what I'll refer to as quick fixes. These are field expedient solutions. They run into problems every day, and sometimes the problem is something that they can work around. So if we've got people who know these things, we want everybody to know that. So I think we ought to establish a best practices center that's going to solicit that kind of information, keep it available, and then make it so that everybody knows that if System A has a problem, System B has a workaround, And the people with system A now know about that workaround from system B, and they might try it and might get themselves back up and running. So a best practices center for those kinds of lessons would be important. Next slide, please. And to fill up that best practices center, we want to encourage people to submit these workarounds that they know about, these quick fixes, for lack of a better term, that moment when you kick the thing and it actually works after you do that. So we want to encourage people to not only do their own what-if analysis with the systems, identify those things that they can fix on their own, and get that information into the hands of this lessons learned center, if you will, so that they can get it out there where everybody knows about it. And one way to encourage that is to provide incentives in the forms of rewards and public acknowledgement and medals and other things like that. Can we get the next slide? And I know that this is a term that nobody likes to hear when we're talking about technology, manual options. There might be a point where a system is down and it is not coming back. Now we are putting the spit and baling wire together. We are bringing this function from that system, that function from this system over there. And finally, if someone had a data book and a piece of paper and a pencil, they could do one part of the thing that that system does if they were trained to do it and had the equipment necessary at hand. So identify the manual options as well in a complete emergency and then train up on them. Can we go with the next slide, please? And so in summation, popular resentment of personal data collection is likely to cause a dramatic expansion of the information disruption industry. That industry's efforts will do direct and indirect damage to a wide range of technological systems, even systems unrelated to personal data collection. This has the potential to seriously impact the information landscape in 2035, if not sooner. And operating in this future environment calls for a broad approach designed to prepare for and combat the wide-ranging impact of the IDI. And can we have the next slide, please? And that is the end of the presentation. My LinkedIn address is here, as well as my author webpage. And it's my understanding that we're going to go to a Q&A at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Vince, that was really phenomenal. We really appreciate it. I know there's been even a lot of discussion in the chat right now as people are extremely interested in this topic. And I really think that what you presented to us gives us a lot to think about now and really gets exacerbated by those disruptive technologies as we go in the future. I want to go ahead and steal from the audience and kind of lead off with the first question in a selfish manner for mad scientists. When you look at the information disruption industry and you're looking at the Department of Defense per se, protecting service members in this industry, and that really takes kind of a holistic effort, right? But what does that mean in terms of tension between that and dependents who are really exposed in that as well? Because we don't have necessarily a Spartan warrior class. We still have soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors that have families. So how do you deal with the tension between those two things and having dependents that are going to be out in the open for that?
That's a great question. I kind of touched a little bit on that with one of the slides. The idea that the deployed soldiers, we're going to be hearing about this going on in the home front. But to answer your question, once the IDI is up and running, and if it is socially acceptable, perhaps even gets legal cover, who knows? This might be one of these things where if you could identify, I'll use the term, the good IDI, the ones who are not criminals, the ones who are not out there actually breaking systems. Who knows? Maybe we could put that together so that it covers everybody. It's almost like a TRICARE for IDI, where you put it together where it's going to be the dependents and the service people, so everybody's protected, and maybe the Defense Department could identify which one of these IDIs is not out there smashing, grabbing, and breaking the laws and harming people, and maybe put something together like that where it would be part of their benefits, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of the same way that right now we have service group members' life insurance
Yeah.
and things of that nature. I think that's extremely interesting. I'm going to switch over to the audience questions real fast, and I'll go ahead and start with some of those. So
Super.
we have from Mark Tocher. I apologize if I butchered your name, Mark. We're already seeing the conflict between privacy protection and government requests in the cases between Apple and the FBI. Is this the beginning of setting the information disruption industry as being non-patriotic?
That's, I read a news article yesterday about apparently the FBI had cracked the code on that phone. If I'm talking about the same thing here, where it was a phone that was involved with, I believe it was a shooting, a mass shooting at one of our defense installations, and that the FBI had asked Apple if they'd open the phone for him, and Apple had refused, and the FBI went in and broke into it anyway. I hope I'm talking about the same story here. Yeah, the problem is the IDI could definitely be depicted as being unpatriotic and outrightly criminal because they are going to be causing a lot of damage out there. As far as connecting them to that storyline there, I almost see it's a conflict. I understand Apple's problem, but at the same time, this was national security here. So I understand why the FBI was after the information. I'm afraid that one there is probably going to have to be, that's one of those instances where the slide about going into the courts, it probably would go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and then it would again be up to public opinion about who exactly is going to be perceived as the bad guys there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another one of those tension points, really.
Right.
In
That's a
order
good one. It's a good question.
In order to score some points with my boss, I will ask his question.
Right.
Mr. Lee Grubbs asked, does the IDI impact the perceived value of the Internet of Things? So there's this idea of the Internet of Things just expanding exponentially over the next several years to where we're looking at trillions of nano sensors and things like that. Does the IDI impact that value?
Absolutely. That is a question that I was thinking about while I was putting the presentation together. The idea that if you've got enough damage out there, you've got that thing I refer to as a kaleidoscope where nobody's really sure about, is this information good? Is this the good information, or is it the bad information that hasn't been identified as bad yet? So the idea of the Internet of Things, you bring the whole question of the legitimacy of the Internet of Things could come into question. So I kept on thinking about this, and I wondered if there might be, if this happens and it really gets going, and now you're kind of almost in this I don't know what to believe time frame. If you'd have yet another industry or just some businesses that focused on being able to put their stamp on information. For example, we can look at this group of credit scores and we can tell you they are exact, and we have our 3-step process and it's trademarked, and everybody comes to trust that and understand that if that stamp's on this thing, we know it hasn't been messed with and that it is daily verified, or some kind of a mechanism like that. Because I do hope I transmitted the idea that the IDI could do tremendous damage, and that the groups that are out there just blowing holes in databases, you might have a solid gold credit score and suddenly it's gone. And that would harm the idea of the Internet of Things. It's a good question.
No,
Yeah.
thank you for a great answer. I actually got 2 questions, kind of a 2-parter here from Mike McGurk, who asked, looking at how the DoD right now hires ethical hackers, is there a space where we need to stand up those kind of agents, or free agents really, to help us in the DoD IDI space? So a kind of cyber command when it comes to that. And these are maybe questions are a little open right now because we have to have policy discussions on these things, but is this an Army or a joint responsibility? So that's as much probably a question for you as it is for us to answer within Army and DoD.
Absolutely. Just full disclosure, this Mike McGurk of whom you speak was my roommate at West Point. So no doubt I sent him into spasms of bad memories about physics, even though actually Mike was on the side of the spectrum where he could actually solve physics problems, where I was the other guy. But no, it's a great question that he's asked there. And we have yet another one of our classmates who was in our company at West Point who has gone on to get a doctorate in artificial intelligence. And long before he did that, right at like beginning of the PC age, I guess, and the personal computing age in the 90s, he was talking to me, and he had this idea where he wanted to just recruit all of the hackers. He didn't care what their physical capabilities were. All he wanted was people who could get in there and do this work. He was going to use them offensively as hackers and defensively by mining their knowledge. So the idea of then bringing in the so-called ethical hackers, I suppose it's kind of like that movie Catch Me If You Can, where the FBI caught the guy who was just
Right.
really, really good at pretending to be other people and running check fraud cases. He's a real individual, Frank Abagnale. And now Frank Abagnale is an advisor to banks about bank fraud. And that was a guy who was actually in prison, and they pulled him out of prison to work with the FBI because they basically felt his talents were being wasted. So I think there is an argument there, and I think the Abagnale case might be a good example to suggest that we could do something like that. Once again, if they're doing something that we don't understand, it's hard to actually monitor them, and it's hard to keep a close rein on them. That would be one of my considerations there, is could they be doing things that we didn't know about, and we only find out about it once it's once it's in the headlines.
Right. I think that makes sense, and to get that kind of adversarial perspective in terms of or get the criminal perspective of how they would do it. A question that we had
Exactly.
A question we had from Brian P that I kind of want to distill down a little bit. He talked a lot about the fact that we sacrifice, and something really you addressed as well, and a little bit in another question, is this idea that we sacrifice a lot of privacy right now for convenience, and it's not something that's given a lot of thought. I know you kind of talked about updates, right? So we update all the time. I would bet my next paycheck that most of us in here have not looked at the user agreement for the next update for iOS or whatever system you're using. So it
Right.
distills down to the question that Brian really had is, then if that's the case, what is the reality of effective data security in the future? And I think you answered that a little bit earlier when we kind of talked Internet of Things, but what do you think is the reality for that effective data security out in the future?
Boy, that is a tough one. That's a well-phrased question there. So the idea is that because for convenience, we're giving up a lot of data security. I think I mentioned earlier that, okay, you got the phone and you got your internet access. And even if the collectors say, we've turned a new leaf, we will never do that again, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. The capability is still there. So somebody, if there is money to be made off of it, will take the data and do wrong, bad things with it. But to come back to that idea of we do give this up for the name of convenience. You know, when I first got my smartphone, I was trying to make sure it couldn't track my location, and I was trying to make sure it didn't have any permissions that it shouldn't have. And I got all the messages every time I tried to hit update all. It says, well, you got to let us do this, you got to let us do that. And finally, I knuckled under and started just hitting update all. So I'm not terribly comfortable with the idea of my data security in an environment like that. Honestly, I don't really have much of an answer on that one. That's one I haven't considered.
No, it's a tough one in terms of the complexity just of that question. I think you know, we have to look at ethics panels just to think about, you know, what is the sacrifice between those two. So I want to combine two questions we had really, and really it comes back to something that you've been discussing already, but I think it bears repeating because we have to think as Army mad scientists. We have to think about in that future space. And as these disruptive technologies become part of the marketplace, Tucker Holmes asked about blockchain in terms of storage for DoD. And I know that's something that's being explored in terms of DoD data centers and how are we going to store and share that data in the future for the millions, if not billions of bits of data that we're always having. And then David Miller had a question about use of AI in the future. So you kind of talked about the opposite of that, not really a Luddite approach, but what happens when all this breaks down and it can't be repaired and it has to be manual? But on the flip side of that coin, what do we do about potential AI solutions in that space? So what do you think about those two questions, really?
You know, the worst part about this is I knew what blockchain was at one point, and now I don't. So I focused on the question of we're going to store our database, our data. We're going to be using blockchain. Now, was that a distributed kind of storage? Am I remembering that correctly? That's what blockchain is.
Yeah, it's kind of. I would have to get someone to explain it better than I could in terms of blockchain essentially being secure. And really encrypted. It's like a distributed ledger. So in terms of blockchain, you can't edit it, delete it, manipulate it without it being realized that this is a shared distributed ledger.
Yeah, and as I mentioned with the skill and daring operators in the IDI, that their goal is to get in, do whatever it is that they were going to do, and get out and leave the system intact and make sure it still functions. So anything that would defeat that, I think would be really a great idea and a great technique. The harm, of course, the danger, of course, is what I already mentioned about measure, countermeasure, countermeasure. We're all aware that whatever we make, somebody else is going to find a way to break through that as well. Or they're just going to find somebody who's actually operating the system and get them to do whatever they want to have happen. So the blockchain idea sounds really good, though, very intriguing. The idea that you could store the data, and then if somebody messed with it, you'd know about it right away. Then I think the second half question was about the artificial intelligence applications here. What was that the question there?
Right.
Yeah. And you know, I really do, I recognize that some of what I said does come across as a bit Luddite or even doomsday-ish, but I'm a big fan of the new technology. You know, I mentioned that mapping system of the nodal diagramming, and someone had been describing how they had this one bank system where they showed them the nodal diagramming of the IPs that were being used to connect into their online banking system. And of course, the thing moves around and this thing connects to that, and this line appears over here. And all of a sudden, two of them went red, and it flashed and flashed and flashed. And it shows that you got two IPs that are exactly identical, two different accounts, allegedly two different locations. And essentially, they had found a hacker while they were doing the demo of this system to this bank. So I would put that in there with the category of the AI, that of course I'd be in favor of that. And it's interesting. It's going to be a steady ratcheting up when you have the measure, countermeasure, countermeasure kind of dance that goes on. It's going to be a steady ratcheting up. And of course, the technology is going to improve because it has to. So we're going to have leaps in technology because we're having people disrupting us.
All right. Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And what I want to do now is just kind of get to our last question so we can wrap everything up. But this has really been phenomenal, really great back and forth.
This has been fun. I enjoyed it.
We really appreciate it. So my old colleague, Carl Wingenbach, asked, looking at IDI, what he really is asking for is your comments on this. There are some proponents of IDI that say what it might become is more of a regulatory space, like what you would see within the EU when it comes to trade and things like that, or taxation and various forms like that. But what do you think about that as opposed to the idea of what is depicted more of a wild, wild west kind of space?
That's intriguing right there. You know, oddly enough, it's kind of that Robin Hood aspect of it. In his own way, Robin Hood, in their own way, Robin Hood and the Merry Men were the regulators. They were keeping the sheriff from getting too far out of control, and the public opinion shifted in their direction because they didn't like what the sheriff was doing. But if Robin and the boys had decided to help themselves out too much, perhaps public opinion would have shifted away from them as well. Maybe it might be that slide where I mentioned the legal ramifications here, where if the IDI did get recognized as being legal, well, even though that would seem to give them carte blanche to do whatever they want, once somebody says that you're legal, you actually start cleaning up your act. It's kind of like you have the bank havens where they started off by saying anybody who wants to put their money here can do that, and we will not ask any questions, and we will not tell anybody. But then they became successful banks, and they got actual assets in there that were not questionable. And then they started getting leaned on by the governments and the bigger banks about their attitude about secrecy. And so they just started dropping the secrecy thing and slowly pushing out their questionable customers because they become successful businesses in spite of themselves. They became legitimate. So that might be something that might happen to the IDI.
I really love the Robin Hood analogy. So I think that was just such a fantastic answer.
Yeah.
Vince, we are so excited. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
It's really been a pleasure. What I want to remind people of, just a couple things. One, a disclaimer is that Vince's webinar on here, this does not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Army Futures Command, or Training and Doctrine Command. But if you want to be able to see the slides from Vince as well as the paper that he put out, we do have that posted on our All Partners Access Network. You can check out and find all the links for all the MadSci content. Check out madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. If you're not already following on Twitter, @ArmyMadSci, if you follow on there, we're going to tweet out a lot of different content for you to be able to see. And we're excited to announce next week what we're going to be having to tie in yet another science fiction authors. As we've had Vince on here today, make sure you check out Vince's work. We're going to have August Cole and Pete Singer, the authors of Ghost Fleet, and they're the authors of a new novel that's coming out called Burn In, A Real Robotic Revolution. And we're going to have them on Wednesday, May 27th, so next week at 1300. So we're going to tweet those details out. You'll be able to find it on madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. Take a look at the APAN site after you go through the Mad Scientist blog or the laboratory, where you can get quick reads about the future twice a week. So we're really excited. Really appreciate everyone coming on. Great conversation in the chat, and we appreciate all the Q&A as well. So make sure you're following us, and we look forward to talking to you all soon. Thanks, Vince.
Thank you.